Imagine living in a world where speaking the truth could ruin your life. A world where new knowledge isn't seen as light, but is treated as a threat. More than 400 years ago, there was a man who did something very simple. He looked up at the sky, but what he saw shook an entire society. His discovery wasn't called genius, it was labeled dangerous knowledge. And he himself was nearly erased from history. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe lived under a belief system that was almost impossible to question. People believed that Earth was the center of the universe. The sun, the planets, and the entire sky revolved around us. This wasn't just the science of the time. It was the intellectual foundation of society. Powerful institutions controlled how people thought, taught, and understood the world. When people believed the cosmic order was fixed, anyone who challenged it was seen as a troublemaker. In that context, science wasn't always welcomed. Sometimes it was seen as something that had to be stopped. In 1609, Galileo Galilei built a version of the telescope more powerful than any observing device that had ever existed. When he pointed it at the night sky, he didn't just see distant points of light. He saw a universe completely different from what people had been taught. The surface of the moon wasn't smooth and perfect. It was filled with light and dark regions, rough and complex. Jupiter didn't stand alone in space. It had small moons orbiting it, much like our moon orbits Earth. And the planets didn't move according to the rigid order people had long believed in. From these observations, Galileo gradually reached a shocking conclusion. Earth was not the center of the universe. We were only a small part of a much larger system. For science, this was a great step forward. But for society at that time, it was a shock. Because if Galileo was right, then the entire way humans understood their place in the universe would have to change. When Galileo made public what he had seen through his telescope, the reaction wasn't applause, it was a heavy silence. Then, a wave of fear spread across Europe. His discoveries weren't seen as scientific progress, but as a threat to an order that had existed for hundreds of years. People began to whisper that these ideas could cause people to lose their sense of direction, make society unstable, and break the intellectual foundation that so many generations had trusted. Galileo's name quickly became a subject of controversy. In public squares, in academies, and in the corridors of power, people no longer called him a scientist. They called him someone who spread unsafe ideas, a man carrying knowledge considered too dangerous for the public. Suddenly, the act of looking at the sky was no longer harmless curiosity. It became an action viewed with suspicion. Questioning the universe was seen as a challenge to the social order. Knowledge, which should have illuminated humanity, now made people uneasy. Galileo gradually realized that the issue was not about right or wrong. The issue was power. He wasn't just facing people who disagreed on a scientific level. He was standing against an entire system that controlled thought. A system that did not allow new ideas to shake old beliefs. The pressure began to appear more clearly. Interrogations, tense confrontations, and warnings all carried the same message. Be silent. In the end, Galileo was pushed into a cruel choice. Either continue to defend what he believed was the truth, or give up his voice to keep his life safe. This wasn't a choice between fame and wealth. It was a choice between being allowed to exist in society or being pushed out of it. Under enormous pressure, he was forced to withdraw his statements in public. The words he had spoken about the universe were required to be denied. His books and research were placed under strict control. New ideas were no longer allowed to spread freely. From a scientist known across Europe, Galileo gradually became an isolated man. He was placed under close supervision. All his research activity was restricted. Every step was watched. For the rest of his life, he lived in a kind of invisible confinement. Not behind bars, but behind the walls of enforced silence. They didn't erase Galileo's name from history, but they did something almost the same. They removed his voice from the public space. The man who had changed how humanity looked at the sky was no longer allowed to speak about what he had seen. He continued to live, but was no longer allowed to speak. He existed, but was forced to remain silent. This was the price of being ahead of one's time. Galileo saw the truth too early, in a world that was not ready to accept it. And sometimes, in human history, knowing too much becomes dangerous. Yet there was one thing no one could stop: time. Decades passed, and Galileo's observations were gradually confirmed by other scientists. Technology advanced, modern telescopes were created, and each time humans looked deeper into the universe, they found that Galileo had been right. The discoveries once seen as dangerous became the very foundation of modern science. Today, humans can observe galaxies billions of light-years away. We send probes into space. We search for signs of life beyond Earth. And all of this began with one man who dared to question and dared to look at the sky when no one else dared to do so. The story of Galileo leaves behind a question worth thinking about. How many ideas in history were once seen as dangerous, simply because they challenged human comfort? How many inventions were once called threats before becoming things that changed the world? And more importantly, even today, are there still truths being hidden simply because they are too powerful to be accepted? Thank you for watching, and if you found this story as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing for more.